Today we are going to do operant conditioning. In one of the lectures, we have already learnt about classical conditioning, which is one of the most important theories in learning. We have also learnt in that lecture that in case of classical conditioning, an unconditional stimulus and a conditioned stimulus are presented together, and ultimately as a result of that learning, the neutral stimulus can generate the response which was initially coming for the unconditional stimulus or the natural stimulus. Now, usually in case of classical conditioning, as we have seen, we deal with spontaneous responses. In case of operant conditioning, our range of behaviors, range of responses is much larger. Let's see it from the very beginning. The name associated with operant conditioning is that of B.F. Skinner. He mentioned that there are two types of behaviors. One is spontaneous or reflexive, the other is operant. Now, as I said, spontaneous responses or behaviors are used more commonly in case of classical conditioning. But in case of operant conditioning, we talk about operants. So what are operants? Most of our behaviors are not simply generated by the environment. For example, we are not forced by the environment to look at one book, to talk, to sing, to throw something like that. Now these behaviors are emitted by the individual, emitted by ourselves as a result of certain kinds of learning. Through such behaviors, we learn to operate upon the environment also. These responses, these behaviors are known as operant behaviors. So operant conditioning is the conditioning of operant behaviors, that is learning where the individual's behavior is modified by its consequences. So we will have to learn about consequences to a great extent here regarding how we operate, how we learn to behave in particular ways in relation to certain kinds of behaviors. Now, Skinner conducted a very famous experiment, on learning. Here is a diagrammatic representation of the thing. In this box known as the Skinner box, you can see there is a rat here and there is an electric grid. In a typical Skinner box, there is an electric grid, there is a lever and there is a food pellet. Now what happens is that sometimes there is food in the food pellet, but the rat cannot access it until the rat pushes the lever. Now the rat does not know how it has to operate to get the food. So initially the rat behaves in different ways randomly, like scratching the walls, like jumping or things like that. Perhaps those behaviors which have earlier helped the rat to get food. Now he cannot get the food and he becomes frustrated, and at one time, just accidentally, he probably presses the lever. As the lever is pressed, there is food in the food pellet which the rat can now access. So it has been seen that gradually the rat learns to press the lever whenever it is hungry. It does not occur in one or two practices, one or two occasions when the lever has been pressed, but gradually through repeated exposures, the rat can learn to deliberately press the lever, that is the operant response for the rat, to press the lever to get the food. Similarly, it may be so designed that if the rat goes to a certain part of this cage, of this box, the Skinner box, electric shocks will be delivered to the rat. So in the same manner, the rat learns not to go to that part of the box. So you see, here are positive or negative consequences for certain kinds of behavior which we can shape. This shaping is a very important term used by Skinner. We can shape the behavior of the rat the way we desire. That is, we can teach the rat to press the lever. We can teach the rat to avoid certain places in the box. Now, how do we measure that learning is taking place? Skinner has suggested that we take a very simple but very effective measure, that is, rate of occurrence of a particular behavior. For example, we can assess how many times in a given hour the rat had pressed the lever. Maybe in the first hour the rat has not discovered the lever, so it did not press it at all. Say in the second hour, accidentally the rat came to press the lever, so there was food. Gradually in the third hour, maybe there are 3 or 4 accidental pressings. Then in the fifth hour, we see that there are more pressings, and say after repeated hours of training, whenever the rat is hungry, it can press the lever. So the rate of occurrence is very important. Skinner has also suggested that we can use a simple frequency graph to understand this rate of occurrence, or we can make a cumulative graph or an ogive to express it. Actually, Skinner prefers an ogive for measuring the operant behavior as it is learnt by the particular organism. As I was saying, shaping is a very important term, a very important concept, and there is another associated concept known as the functional analysis of behavior. To explain this, Skinner says that for every learnt behavior there is an antecedent and there is a consequence. That is why there is the ABC model: antecedent, behavior, consequent. And as Skinner said, what our behavior will be ultimately decided by the consequence. Skinner preferred this ABC model because it helps to divide the complex chunks of behavior in smaller manageable units. As I was saying, shaping takes place in the rat's behavior. Pressing the lever, that is shaping of a particular way of behaving, takes place in the rat. In the first hour, there is probably 0 occurrences, in the second hour 2 occurrences, in the third hour 5 occurrences. And it has also been found before the behavior is learnt completely, there are smaller steps in it. So successive approximation basically means there are certain steps that indicate that learning is taking place. We are closer to our goal, to our target. So before the ultimate desired behavior is enacted, the subject, the organism, engages in other smaller behaviors which may be considered as steps to the final behavior. Now what should be the role of the trainer here? If these successive approximations, these smaller steps are rewarded appropriately, learning will take place pretty soon. Actually, Skinner found this quite accidentally. One day he was trying to teach a pigeon to swipe a ball. Now the accidental, he was giving certain rewards, but somehow the accidental swiping of the ball was not happening. The pigeon did not swipe the ball in any chance. It was trying all sorts of behaviors. Now after 1, 2, 3 hours, Skinner himself got bored and he simply thought, why not give some reward to the pigeon, at least for trying so hard. So whenever the pigeon was looking at the ball or coming close to it, he started giving certain rewards to the pigeon. And then he found that although the accidental occurring of the thing has not happened till now, suddenly there was more probability of doing that because the pigeon was there around the ball. It was looking at the ball more closely. So the accident, quote unquote accident, happened earlier than was expected by random chance alone. So from this incident, Skinner understood that if we learn to reward smaller targets, then it will be better then it will facilitate our teaching or training of the organism sooner. Now this reward, this is known as reinforcement. When we have studied classical conditioning, we have found that there also we have talked about reinforcement. For example, in case of Pavlov's dog, the food, that is the unconditional stimulus, that was by itself the reinforcer. However, in case of operant conditioning, since we are dealing with operands and not spontaneous reflexes, the unconditioned stimulus will not be the reinforcer. We will have to introduce the reinforcer as a consequent. And this reinforcement must be given intelligently. Now we can have different types of reinforcements. For example, on one dimension we can have positive or negative reinforcement. A positive reinforcement is of course something good, something rewarding, and negative reinforcement is something which is painful. For example, the electric shock. Then there can be primary and secondary reinforcement. What is the example of primary reinforcement? Something that satisfies our basic need. For example, food can be primary reinforcement. What would be a secondary reinforcement? Something which does not satiate our needs directly. For example, money. You cannot eat money, but you can buy your food with money. So that is symbolic or secondary reinforcement. Now, how often to give reinforcements? Skinner says that we can go for schedules of reinforcement. Reinforcement can be continuous, reinforcement can be intermittent. You can always give reward to your trainee. For example, you can always give chocolates to your baby for learning something. But we find that if we always give chocolates to the baby for doing something, at one point of time the child will learn to exploit us for chocolates. So that is not exactly what we want to happen. That is why Skinner says that usually, at least for higher levels of organisms, it's better to give intermittent reinforcement. Now intermittent reinforcement can also be of two types. It can be interval reinforcement, it can be ratio reinforcement. Interval reinforcement, it means that you give the reinforcement after certain time intervals. For example, you may decide to give the reward after 5 minutes, every 5 minutes or every 1 hour you give the reinforcement. That is known as interval scheduling. Ratio scheduling means you are supposed to give the reward after a given number of successful responses. For example, if you decide that you will give the reward after 5 successful responses, it may so happen that 5 successful responses will take 1 hour. It may so happen that it will take 5 minutes. In either case, whenever the 5 successful responses are obtained, we give the reward. This is like, we can say to our child that if you do 2 sums correctly, I will give a reward. Doing 2 sums correctly may take 1 hour or 2 hours or 2 days, doesn't matter, you will have to do 2 sums correctly. That is ratio reinforcement. Now each of these interval and ratio reinforcements, they can be given on a fixed or variable schedule throughout the learning procedure. For example, if I want to teach something, we can decide that we will give it after every 1 hour, or we can decide to give it after every 5 successful responses. That is fixed schedule for interval and ratio kind of reinforcement. But we can also decide that we will not keep this time or the number of successes absolutely fixed. Maybe we will give a reward after 1 hour and the next reward may come after 3 hours and then again it may come after half an hour. So this way the time interval may not be fixed, it may be variable, and for ratio maybe I will give the reward after 2 sums, then after 5 sums, then after 10 sums, then again after 3 sums, like that. Variable scheduling is something which is not fixed. So we can find 5 subtypes of reinforcement altogether, 2 kinds of interval, fixed and variable reinforcement, 2 kinds of ratio, fixed and variable ratio reinforcement, and continuous reinforcement. As I said, it has to be rendered intelligently depending upon the animal or the person you are giving the training to and the overall difficulty level of the problem. Now sometimes we hear the word punishment. For example, when electric shock is being given to the rat, is it punishment or is it negative reinforcement? Punishment is aversive consequence of undesired behavior. When I want the rat not to go in a particular part of the box, I want the rat to refrain from a natural behavior, I will give punishment because going to that part is undesired. In that case, the electric shock will be a punishment. But the same electric shock can be a negative reinforcer if my purpose is to elicit certain behavior. For example, if I want the rat to move its paw and if I continue giving electric shock until it moves its paw, then that will be a negative reinforcer. That is, the basic difference is that punishment is given to reduce undesirable behavior, negative reinforcement is given to elicit desirable behavior. Now I will come to another issue, that is generalization versus discrimination in operant conditioning. Whenever the subject has learned something, for example, the rat has learned to press the lever to get the food, will it generalize to other objects of levers of different shapes? It has been found that yes, the rat does. Because unless we could generalize, unless we could transfer our learning from one kind of thing to another, we would have needed to teach each and every small learning in different occasions. We do not. We can use anything as a table because we know that something which is of this height, this can be used as a table. But then we also need to discriminate because generalization is not the only thing. To discriminate, we have to learn the difference between two things. That can be done by giving reward to, say, the stimulus S and by giving punishment to the stimulus which is similar to S but we want to discriminate it from S, that is S1. So if I reward the response in S and if I punish the same response to S1, then gradually the organism will learn to discriminate. So basically this is about Skinner's experiments and his major issues. Now I will come to the implications and applications of Skinner's position. He did not want to use words like personality or thought in his entire scheme of things. What he emphasized was that human beings, even human beings, do not have free will. In his 1971 book entitled Beyond Freedom and Dignity, Skinner presented his ideas based on his experiments on human existence also. According to him, man is completely determined, and I emphasize completely determined by his conditioning history. Skinner was insistent on this philosophy. There is nothing called free will, so one does basically what one is reinforced to do. Now this has a good side also, because if we decondition, if we change the nature of reinforcement, then we will be able to tell them that there are certain things which can be unlearned also, which can be deconditioned also. Now, he also says that there is no point in debating whether man is rational or irrational, because both rationality and irrationality are inner states, and therefore they are not objects of our scientific inquiry. In science, there would be no inner state, only manipulation of behavior by conditioning and reinforcement. So, Skinner also tried to explain psychopathology from the operant conditioning perspective. He said that we learn many pathological behaviors whenever we are working with certain kinds of reinforcements. Let us take, for example, the case of a conduct disordered child. What does a child with conduct disorder does? The child initially starts demanding for things, telling lies, cheating others, and maybe the parents feel frustrated and exhausted. But sometimes they also encourage this behavior. Perhaps the child is demanding something very costly, and the parents think that to avoid the hassle, they can give it to the child. So now the child learns that if he wants something from the parents, and if he can demand it with force, if he can throw a kind of tantrum, then ultimately there is a positive consequence to this. Now this positive consequence imprints the behavior, shapes the behavior by giving the idea that there will be something positive in it. Now that is what Skinner calls the functional analysis of behavior. If we functionally analyze the child's behavior, we will find stages, steps, smaller approximations. If we ask about the history of the child, we will learn how gradually this so-called negative behavior, undesired response of the child, has been rewarded in his history. Maybe by the parents, maybe by somebody else in the family. Maybe somebody did not simply care at all, and the child has learned to fight and get things like that. There may be differences in the history, differences in the kinds of reinforcement, but it may be said that the child's behavior has been reinforced. There is also another point that needs to be mentioned here, because when we were talking about the types of reinforcement, there remains the question that what kind of reinforcement is best for all. It has been found that the variable ratio reinforcement is the best. Even in case of the child, we can see that there may be occasions when the tantrum did not win him the things, but somehow overall in the history there has been some kind of positive reinforcement for the tantrum and demanding behavior. So we can see that if we look deep into the history of certain psychopathologies, then we will be able to see how certain unwanted behaviors have been reinforced in the life. Then Skinner says that we can also go for conditioning of social attitudes. For example, say certain kinds of prejudices, even pessimism, might have been rewarded in certain ways. Actually, Skinner says that when a person seems to have too much negative attitude toward other persons or self, it is possible that we can probe the history of that person, and we can find that somehow the environment never adequately rewarded that person's efforts to go out and mix with people. So the person has developed this attitude that nobody is really interested, or perhaps the person himself is not adequately interesting, because in his personal history he was never rewarded for his outward responses. Now these kinds of explanation of pathology automatically tells us how we can use it for psychotherapy. If we know that the person has been conditioned toward this kind of negative behaviors through certain consequences, we can re-manipulate those consequences, and through reward and punishment we can try to change that behavior. One very famous example of using the operant principles in case of children is token economy. By token economy, we mean a process of psychotherapy where for any good behavior the child is given a token. Now each token may amount to certain amount of money or whatever. Suppose to buy a chocolate, a child has to get 10 tokens. Now for each good behavior, or say for 5 good behaviors, the child will get 1 token. Thus the child will collect all those tokens, and he will also learn delay of gratification as the consequence will come later on. This token economy has been found to be very useful for children, particularly with diseases like ADHD or conduct disorder or likes. So we can say that Skinner's theory of operant conditioning has very important applications everywhere, but it has been criticized mostly from the cognitive psychologists because it gives a very mechanized version of the universe. The self-psychologists have criticized it quite bitterly because they think that the person is missing from this entire theorization. Skinner's viewpoint has of course been criticized from the Gestalt's viewpoint. It has been criticized from the psychoanalytic viewpoint. But despite the some validity of all these critiques, we can very well say that it has its own applications, and it emphasizes the thing that by manipulating consequences we can really change the behavior of persons. Actually, it has been found that consequences do matter. We all know that. And Skinner would say that whenever there have been failures, that is owing to not being able to use it intelligently. So we can try to be more intelligent in our understanding of this thing. I suppose you understand that the critiques are true, but it does not hamper at least the partial utility of Skinnerian principles in everyday life. Thank you so very much.